Okay, so who's ready to nerd out on saddles with me? We're gonna take a look at two revolutionary saddles, the Physique Vento Argo and the Specialized S-Works Pro Mirror. But first, we're gonna take a quick dive into the world of modern 3D printing, elastomeric lattices, pressure mapping, and how Specialized and Physique used additive manufacturing techniques to make what's, in my estimation, two of the most comfortable saddles I've ever ridden. If you'd rather not hear about all that, then go ahead and fast forward about 2 minutes to get to the actual shootout. One of the biggest advantages to 3D printing is that it's created a lane for the quick and cost-effective creation of prototypes, which then enables designers and engineers to iterate and test their ideas rapidly, which dramatically reduces the time to market for new products. My favorite bike nerd, Josh Portner of Silka, summed it up best in a 2022 interview with Bike Radar when he said, "The real advantages are that you can essentially print anything in any geometry almost without limit. You can print unlimited geometries on the inside of things, which has never been possible." This is especially important in the realm of bike manufacturing because when compared to other big industries like automotive and aerospace, we're the only ones on Earth making technically complex products at comparatively low volumes. Physique was the early adopter, jumping on the 3D train way back in 2019 with their first gen Antares versus Evo. And not to be outdone, Specialized caught on about a year later and launched the S-Works Mirror. Both brands partnered with the leader in the space, Carbon 3D. If you've ever seen the Adidas 4D Futurecraft line, then you're already familiar with their work. Their goal was to build the first digitally printed lattice saddle using Carbon 3D's Carbon Digital Light Synthesis, or Carbon DLS process. Both brands explored several vectors during the design process: impact absorption, energy return, greater comfort, and increased control. What they discovered early on is that an elastomeric carbon lattice can be almost infinitely tuned to address fit and comfort. And the ability to sling out multiple prototypes at a very low cost meant the engineers could create a true breakthrough in saddle comfort. And they cut their time to market from 24 months down to 10. As a side note, one of the things I found super interesting when reading the case study was this question: would a rider prefer less impact or greater energy return? So they printed prototypes to address each variable, and their testing showed that uniform softness caused the kind of instability you'd feel with a squishy gel saddle, and also caused reduced rider control. They were able to address this issue immediately with a compression gradient design, which pocketed the sit bones in a soft center and steadily increased the stiffness throughout the teardrop zones. The result was a perfect combination: a bike saddle that optimally distributes pressure to increase comfort while giving the rider the control they need to perform at their best. Now, remember that because it's important, and I'll come back to it in a second. So in theory, we've got two amazing saddles here. And if you're shopping for a new seat, or if you're like me and you're on that forever journey to find the one perfect saddle to rule them all, then you should absolutely have both of these at the top of your list. But how do you choose which one's right for you? Let's start with the Physique Argo. I made a bold move and put this one on my all-road bike the night before a 4-day winter training camp. The bike has a max tire clearance of about 38C, and I've got it set up for 50-50 road and gravel riding with 36C tires. And because it's essentially a detuned road bike, the rear end can be a bit harsh on the rough stuff. So harsh that I installed an Ergon CF all-road post to take the edge off, and I was in the process of trying a few different saddles to soften things up even more when this one arrived. I was running on the heavily padded 130mm by 300 Arione VS, which I thought was the one until I hit that first dirt section on the shorter and wider Argo. This one's 140 by 265. And it's tough to find new words to describe the sensations I felt in that moment. So I'll say this: after about 60 seconds, I knew that my lifelong quest to find the perfect saddle had finally ended. The elastomeric web performed exactly as promised. It somehow manages to deliver an extremely soft and compliant ride, yet still maintains a surprising amount of firmness and rebound. As the ride progressed, it basically disappeared underneath me. I didn't think about it, didn't worry about it, or have to make any annoying micro adjustments as the day went on and on. The thing that a lot of reviews call out is that the surface of the saddle feels rubbery and has more grip than a traditional saddle, so that took a little getting used to, but once I figured out how to use that to my advantage, I fell in love with it. Here's what I mean. Usually when you approach a very steep or technical section, it's a good idea to move your hips toward the nose of the saddle and use a combination of core muscles to hold that shift in your center of gravity. Problem is you end up fighting gravity a little and your hips tend to slide back on the saddle because it's kind of slippery. Once you scoot up on the Argo, you're locked in and you can focus all your watts and attention on cleaning that tough section. It's a small, nuanced thing, but it makes a huge difference in handling. Possibly the difference between walking that section and riding it. I have a similar story with the S-Works saddle. It was installed the same night before, but on a different bike and under a different rider who came to town for the camp. He's a longtime power saddle rider, and he brings his power saddle with him every year, so I was certain he'd pull the mirror off the bike after the first day. That didn't happen. He loved it so much, I caught him trying to sneak it home in his suitcase. Okay, not really, but he did ask me if he could have it when I'm done testing it. So, after that week on the Argo, I set out to try the mirror for myself. The bike setup was a little different though. It was on a true blue gravel bike with clearance for big tires and slightly longer geometry. But in this case, I had an Envy dropper post installed. Now, I love the idea of a dropper on a true gravel bike, but one of my biggest gripes about the Envy post is that it's incredibly stiff. There's zero compliance or flex, so the saddle choice on that kind of setup is super important. The saddle it replaced was another Arione VS, which is 13 millimeters narrower than the Pro Mirror I tested, with an overall length that's way shorter than the 300 millimeter Arione at 143. So the question I was asking, and the one you're probably asking too, was, is there really any difference between the two? The answer is absolutely yes. The first thing I noticed was the compliance. Even though the saddle and the rails are shorter, the shock absorption was on par with the Argo, if not a touch better, because the stiffer seat post was delivering more shock and making it work a little harder. Perhaps the width had something to do with that too, but for me, it flares out to be a little too wide too soon, which took some getting used to because I could feel the sides of the saddle more than the Argo. I was worried it would lead to irritation or saddle sores, but thankfully it hasn't been the case, and I've been able to comfortably ride it for 3 to 4 hour rides without issue. I've also grown to love the shorter nose because it lets me keep my sit bones on the comfy part of the saddle while I'm throttling it in the drops. On the longer Arione or even the Argo, I can't do that without creating some pressure in places you don't want a lot of pressure when you're going over bumps. It's definitely much better on the Argo because the nose has the elastomeric lattice, but the shorter nose on the mirror eliminates almost all contact down there, which is a stark difference when you're down low. One last thing, if you put them side by side with other saddles from Physique and Specialized, I'll admit, they're quite pricey. But here's what you have to remember when you're buying any saddle. The seat is one of only 5 contact points on your bike, and it supports 60% or more of your weight. And your feet are in charge of 100% of your power transfer. A bad saddle can make or break a long ride, so it's one of the most important component choices you can make on any bike. If you think about a good set of carbon-soled cycling shoes, they can be over $300, and they typically last you 3 to 4 years. These saddles are engineered to outlast and outperform traditional foam saddles by many years, and they create a near therapeutic level of comfort and performance. So, when you put it into that perspective, you really get your money's worth. And if you're speccing one of these on a custom-built bike, the increase in price over a standard saddle is a small fraction of the overall cost, even on an Ultegra spec bike. So, which one should you choose? Well, for me, I think the scales tilt in the favor of the Argo because I'm still kind of locked into a more traditional saddle size, and the slightly narrower tail fits my anatomy better. Ultimately, the choice between these two saddles will depend on your individual preferences, your riding style, and of course your budget. But if you're struggling to find a comfortable fit or position on really any bike, road, mountain, or gravel, the Argo and the Mirror are the hack, the shortcut, the holy grail of comfort. So choose wisely. Okay, so you've heard from me, you've probably heard enough from me. My buddy Ian's here. He's got some questions that he's gonna ask about his experience with these saddles.
All right, Andy, I do have a question. I've oftentimes thought about these saddles, and I've never been able to ride them, but I've always thought, man, are those gonna be abrasive on my bibs, and are they gonna tear into them or anything like that? Did you experience anything like that in your testing?
So that's a good question. Are they abrasive? No. Are they sticky? Yeah, so they're not and I think the Argo is a little stickier than the Mirror, because if you look at the surface of it, there's a little more surface area here. And what I mean by sticky is, and I kind of mentioned this in the review, once you set down on it with your bib, you're kind of locked in. You're not gonna move around fore and aft like you would on a traditional, leather or Microtech saddle. It's important to remember that and think ahead before you make moves from the tail to the nose to adjust for different types of terrain. The other thing I noticed, and a couple of the other guys that rode these with me noticed, is that they can tend, when it gets hotter and you get sweaty and there's a lot of moisture, they do tend to hold on to your bibs, and your chamois can slide around, it holds your chamois here, right? And it kind of slides around and your chamois abrades you a little bit. So you just have to be cognizant of that. Wasn't bad, but it does happen when things get really hot and sweaty. So if you're in a humid climate, keep that in mind.
Gotcha. That actually brings me to a question. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in my questions, because I've thought about people on time trial bikes. Sometimes they put the sandpaper on there. So maybe these could be good for, certain disciplines. There's one better for road or gravel, or maybe time trial. Are there any disciplines that you could think of these saddles being good for?
I think I rode gravel, I did road, I put it on my mountain bike for a little bit. I haven't ridden a time trial in 15 years and won't ever ride one again. That's not my jam. I loved it on the mountain bike, because that's where, on super technical stuff, you're shifting around a lot, you're moving around a lot. You're coming up on a really steep, short pitch, and you gotta get really up on the nose, right, to make sure you're not gonna roll off the trail. Really liked it on the mountain bike. And the other thing that this lattice does is it just takes the edge off of those low and even high frequency bumps. So it's like having a few millimeters of added suspension that you wouldn't have. I ride a hardtail.
Okay,
so
I was gonna ask you that.
These things are great when it comes to that. But of all the disciplines, what they're best at, I would say your typical gravel, because you're going from road, where they're nice and firm, to gravel, where there's lots of bumpy stuff underneath you, and it kind of brings in that need to hit those technical spots and lock in on the saddle, like I mentioned.
Nice. Another question I had was about fit. I know it's a question we get a lot of time. People might be running a traditional saddle that is longer. Maybe even a little longer than this. This is a little bit more of a traditional length. This Specialized one's a little bit shorter. When you were changing saddles from what you usually ride to these saddles, was it hard to get the fit measurement done, or did you what calculations did you use?
I didn't really use any calculations. I am 77 centimeters from the top of the saddle to the center of the bottom bracket on every single bike. That's like where I go. I ride 0 setback seat posts and everything, and I start with the saddle like in the dead middle, right? So I put the seat post right in the middle, line it up there, and I'll move it fore and aft, a millimeter or two here and there. And as long as I followed that kind of center line methodology on this saddle and on this saddle, they lined up pretty much within millimeters of where the Arione and the Versus that I had on the other bike. So from like a fore aft fitting position, it was pretty easy to dial it in. And I talked about that 77 centimeter measurement. These are I guess you would call it the overall stack height here of the saddle. Pretty comparable to the other models as well. And then the deflection or the suspension that you get out of these as well, it is around the same, so I didn't really have to deviate at all from that standard 77 that I typically ride.
When you were kind of putting on the bike, you talked about the center of the saddle is kind of where you were measuring. Yep. So you didn't really even consider the nose when you're putting it on your saddle.
You can't really do that with these, because if you look at how different they are, from back to nose, it's huge. Yep. Especially with this one, you really have to think about the adjustment, the placement from here, because if you adjust it on okay, I'm going to adjust where the nose is, well, then you end up with the saddle being it's like an inch.
Right, exactly. But some people will measure their reach on their bike from the nose of their saddle to their handlebars, so that might be something to consider when they're going to switch to a saddle like this.
You can maybe do it with this one, but with this one, you really have to put this saddle up against your current saddle and subtract your current saddle's nose from this nose and kind of start from there. That's how I do it.
Cool. The last question I have for you is just about the holes in the saddle. Is it more ventilated? Was that comfortable, or did you even notice that on your ride?
I didn't really notice, but I'm gonna look for it on my next ride. You would assume that it is, and a lot of the reviews I've seen have said that not that it's more ventilated, but that it's more frustrating to ride these in wet weather because you get all of the mud and the junk and the whatever caked up in here.
Yeah.
We did ride these in the rain for a couple of days, and I mean, they were pretty easy to clean. Whether or not it's like super ventilated or not, I don't know, but it's something I'm gonna look for sure.
Yeah, just something to think about. Well, Andy, I really appreciate you giving us a review on the saddles.
Yeah,
I know you had
fun.
some time in the saddle, which was great. If you have any questions at home, please leave them down in the comments. Make sure you like this video and subscribe. And if you're considering one of these 3D printed saddles, reach out to one of our gearheads. They can definitely help you out. Have a good time out on the road. Thanks.
Yeah.